Snowflakes spun like silver sparks in the beam of the shelter's security light. Beyond the chain-link fence, a small shadow slipped through the drift, paws quick, head low. Claire held her breath as she recognized the ragged terrier, Jasper, vanishing into the black edge of the forest. This was not the first time. Bread, biscuits, scraps every morning gone, always after Jasper's silent escapes. No bark, no whine, no joy, just that hollow stare. Claire's boots crunched over frozen earth as she followed the trail, the world narrowing to the sharp rhythm of her steps and the faint swish of Jasper's tail ahead. The trees closed in. Breathless, she caught a glimpse of the loaf clamped in his jaws, snow crusting his fur. Then the forest opened into a clearing, and what Claire saw waiting there made the cold feel suddenly endless. The shelter lay quiet under a pale shroud of snow. Wind carried a low hum across the open yard, brushing against the chain link and rattling it with a hollow chime. Inside, the air smelled faintly of straw and bleach, a mix of comfort and caution. Claire stood in the dim glow of the hallway light, one hand resting on the latch of the back door. She had been listening for over an hour, letting the cold creep into her fingers, waiting for the sound she had begun to expect every night. It came at last, a faint scuff, the click of claws on the concrete floor. The muted thud of a body squeezing past the corner of the kennels. She moved silently, easing the door open just wide enough to let the frozen air spill inside. Beyond the doorway, a shape slipped from shadow to shadow, ears flattened, tail brushing low. Jasper. His scruffy coat was tipped with frost, his movements sharp and quick, like a creature who had lived too long outside the safety of walls. Claire narrowed her eyes, watching as he darted to the far fence line. He paused only to glance back, his dark eyes reflecting the security light in a way that made him seem older than his small frame. In his mouth, a pale shape dangled, the edges torn half a loaf of bread from the kitchen. She had counted every biscuit and slice the night before, placing them high on the shelf. Yet somehow, Jasper had them again. She stepped out into the cold, her boots sinking into a thin crust of snow. The wind hit her face and filled her ears, muffling every sound except the steady crunch of her own steps. The yard stretched to the edge of the forest, where the trees began in a thick tangle, their bare branches clawing at the pale sky. Jasper slipped through a gap in the fence, his movements fluid, like a path well-traveled. Claire hesitated at the fence. The rules were clear: never leave the shelter grounds at night without telling someone. But the image of Jasper returning each morning with ice clinging to his fur had gnawed at her for days. He never ate the food he took, not in front of anyone, not at all, it seemed. She had tried to follow before, but had always lost sight of him. Tonight the snow was fresh, the air still, and his paw prints were sharp and unbroken. She climbed through the gap, her coat snagging on the wire, tearing a thin line in the fabric. The snow in the forest lay deeper, muffling her steps. The cold settled into her chest, each breath drawing sharp and thin. Jasper's tracks cut a straight path between the trees. She followed, glancing often at the shadows shifting between trunks. The forest had a way of closing in around a person, pressing its silence until every creak and sigh became something more. Her boots struck a patch of ice hidden beneath the powder, sliding for a moment before she caught herself. The wind here was softer, trapped between the trees. In the distance, a faint swish marked Jasper's tail swaying with his stride. He moved with purpose, head held just high enough to keep his prize above the snow. The loaf swung slightly with each step, its pale crust catching what little light slipped through the branches. Claire kept her pace steady. Too fast and she would make noise, too slow and she might lose him. The smell of damp earth rose through the snow, mixed with the dry scent of bark stripped bare by winter. A thin stream crossed her path, its surface frozen in pale ribbons. She stepped over it, her eyes never leaving the movement ahead. The trees thickened. The air felt heavier here, the light dimming as the sky closed above in a lattice of branches. Jasper paused once, ears turning as if he had heard something deeper in the forest. Then he pressed on, his pace quickening. Claire's legs burned from the cold and the climb over uneven ground, but she forced herself forward. A crow broke the silence overhead, its wings slicing the air. The sound made Jasper stop short. Claire froze, holding her breath. His head turned slightly, but he did not look back. After a long moment, he moved again, stepping over a fallen log dusted in snow. Beyond it, the ground leveled and widened. Claire reached the edge of a small clearing. The snow here was untouched except for a single path leading to the far side where a cluster of low shapes huddled beneath the shelter of a half-fallen tree. Jasper's pace slowed as he approached them. The loaf still hung from his jaws, but his posture had changed, softer, lower, almost cautious. She stepped forward, her boots silent in the deep snow. The shapes beneath the tree stirred. Something shifted in the shadows, and a sound drifted across the clearing. It was not a bark, not a growl. It was smaller, higher, the thin whimper of something young. Jasper lowered the bread into the snow and backed away a few steps. The shapes emerged slowly. Claire's breath caught. They were not grown dogs, they were pups. 4 of them, their fur patchy, their legs thin and trembling. Their eyes were too big for their faces, their ribs pressing against their skin. One stepped forward, nose twitching at the loaf. The others followed, moving with the hesitant steps of animals who had learned to be wary. The sight rooted her in place. The cold no longer seemed to matter. Questions crowded her mind. How had they survived this long out here? Where was their mother? How had Jasper found them? And why had no one else noticed? The smallest pup reached the bread and tore at the crust with tiny teeth. Jasper stood a few feet away, watching, his body still. The other pups joined, their movements quick and desperate. The loaf disappeared faster than Claire would have believed possible. When it was gone, they looked up at Jasper, and something in their eyes softened. Claire took a single step into the clearing, the snow crunching beneath her. All 5 heads turned toward her at once, Jasper's and the 4 pups. Jasper did not move. His eyes locked on hers, unreadable. The pups pressed closer together, their bodies trembling, not from cold, but from the presence of a stranger. A branch cracked somewhere deeper in the forest. Claire turned her head toward the sound. It was not close, but it was not far either. When she looked back, Jasper had moved to stand between her and the pups. His stance was low, protective, his gaze fixed on her in warning. The noise came again, closer this time, not the shuffle of an animal, heavier, measured. Claire's heart climbed into her throat. Whatever was out there was heading their way. The forest did not breathe. For a moment the world seemed to hold its own breath, as though listening. Claire stood still in the snow, her eyes searching the wall of trees beyond the clearing. The sound came again, a slow crunch of weight pressing down on frozen ground, then another. The rhythm of a creature that knew where it was going and did not care who heard. Jasper's fur bristled along his spine. His head lowered, not in fear, but in warning. Claire could almost feel the thread of tension pulling taut between them, stretching from his steady stance to her pounding heartbeat. The pups pressed themselves closer together beneath the half-fallen tree, their tiny shapes quivering against one another. The sound grew clearer. Something large was moving between the trees, weaving through the trunks with steady purpose. Claire's breath came shallow, the cold air clawing at her lungs. She did not know whether to move toward Jasper or back into the safety of the shadows. Every instinct told her to retreat, but her feet would not obey. A shape emerged from the darkness between 2 great pines. The light from the clearing caught on its fur, dark and heavy, the kind of coat made for deep winters. Broad shoulders rolled with each step, the snow swallowing the sound of its paws. Its eyes glimmered briefly, catching the pale sky, before locking on the movement at the far edge of the clearing. It was not a man, and it was not a dog. Claire had grown up in places where you could walk for miles without seeing another soul, but she had never seen an animal like this so close. The creature paused, its head tilting ever so slightly as it took in the sight of Jasper, the pups, and the strangers standing in the open. It was not hunger she saw in its gaze, not exactly. It was something older, something that measured distance and advantage. Jasper did not flinch. His stance widened, his tail stiffening. He took a slow step forward, placing himself squarely between the pups and the clearing. The creature's gaze shifted to him, neither moved. Claire's heart was a drumbeat in her ears. The cold pressed harder now, not with the stillness of winter, but with the threat of something breaking loose. She took one slow step back, her boot sinking silently into the snow. The creature's ears twitched. It did not look at her, but she knew it had noticed. Jasper's gaze flicked to her for the briefest moment, then back to the creature. His body tensed in a way she had only seen when dogs prepared to sprint or to fight. The muscles in his shoulders shifted beneath his scruffy coat. Claire knew that whatever came next, it would happen quickly. The first movement came from the edge of the clearing. The creature stepped forward, slow and deliberate, snow puffing softly around its legs. The pups whimpered, a thin, high sound that cut through the air. Jasper took another step forward, his head lowering until his chin nearly touched the snow. His breath rose in small clouds. Claire's hands were fists at her sides. She could feel the urge to run gathering in her chest, a heavy pull that made her legs tremble. But running would draw attention. Running would leave the pups exposed. She did not know what she could possibly do, but she knew she could not leave. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of the shelter's feed room grain and dried kibble. Claire's mind caught on that detail, absurd as it seemed, and she wondered if that was what had brought the creature here. She took another step, this time toward Jasper. Her boots whispered in the snow. The creature stopped. Its eyes narrowed. For a moment, all sound vanished, no wind, no creak of branches, no shuffle of paws. Then Jasper moved, not with the reckless speed of an attack, but with the slow, steady steps of a dog, making his position clear. He angled himself so that his body created a wall between the pups and the open clearing. Claire reached him then, close enough to see the frost clinging to the wiry hair along his back. She kept her voice silent, her movements small, matching his posture. The creature's gaze flicked between them, perhaps weighing whether the effort was worth the risk. Then, without sound, it turned. The heavy shoulders rolled again, carrying it back into the trees. It did not run. It did not hurry. It vanished as silently as it had appeared, swallowed by the lattice of trunks and shadow. Claire let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her knees ached from the tension, her fingers stiff from the cold. Jasper remained where he was, watching the place where the creature had disappeared. Only when several long moments passed without sound did he turn and walk back to the pups. They were still huddled together, eyes wide, paws shifting nervously in the snow. Jasper lowered his head and touched each one with his nose in turn. The smallest licked his chin, a tiny flick of trust. Claire felt something in her chest tighten. She sank to a crouch a few feet away, careful not to startle them. The pups watched her, unsure. She could see every rib, the thinness of their legs, the frost clinging to the fur around their muzzles. They would not last long in this cold without food and shelter. Jasper looked at her again, and in that look was something that made her feel as though she had stepped into a world that existed long before she arrived. He had been feeding them for days, maybe longer. Every night slipping out, risking the cold, risking whatever moved in these trees to keep them alive. Claire knew what she had to do, but getting them back to the shelter would not be simple. The pups were weak and frightened, and the forest held more than one set of eyes. The path back was long, and she could not carry all of them at once. The sky above was fading toward gray. Soon it would be dark, and in the dark the forest would belong to things that moved more easily in shadow. She glanced over her shoulder at the gap between the trees. If they were going to move, it had to be now. Jasper stepped closer to her, his breath a soft cloud in the cold. The pups pressed against him, as though they already knew he would protect them. Claire reached out her hands slowly, letting them catch her scent. The smallest one took a hesitant step toward her. Behind them, somewhere far but not far enough, the sound of movement returned. Snow shifted in the trees like a soft warning. The distant movement grew into a steady rhythm. Claire kept low beside the half-fallen trunk. Jasper stood over the pups with a body that looked small yet unshakable. The smallest pressed into his legs. The others trembled in a knot of thin limbs and wide eyes. They could not wait any longer. The light would die soon. The cold would grow teeth. Things that watched from the dark would draw closer. Claire eased forward on her knees. She reached for the nearest pup with slow hands. Its fur was dry and brittle at the tips. Its ribs rose and fell in a shallow flutter. She slid it into the fold of her coat and closed the zipper as far as she dared without pressing too hard on its chest. It gave a faint squeak, then stilled. Warmth seeped between them. Jasper watched her with a look that felt like a test, not suspicion, a quiet measure of intent. She nodded at him without words. She pointed to the path they had come from and then to the three pups who still huddled in the drift. He seemed to understand. He moved to the edge of the clearing and stared into the trees as if scanning a map only he could read. Claire gathered the second pup. This one fought weakly at first, then sagged. She tucked it into the deep hood of her coat and held the fabric against her chest. Only two remained under the shelter of the log, the smallest and a lanky one with a pale patch over one eye. The lanky one tried to crawl after Jasper and toppled. Claire slid one arm beneath its belly and held it close. It was far too light. A new sound cut the air, not a creature, not the slow tread they had heard before. It was a distant clatter like thin wood striking thin wood, branches knocking in a gust that did not reach the clearing, then silence again. The forest felt like a lung that had stopped. Claire stood with careful steps, three pups secured against her body, one still under the fallen trunk. Jasper touched the last pup with his nose. The tiny body lifted its head and set it down again. He looked at Claire. She could carry only so much. Frost smoked from her breath. She weighed the choice in a span of heartbeats. She set the lanky pup down just at her feet and pressed her shin to keep it steady. Then she reached for the smallest and slid it beneath her coat with the first. She pulled the zipper higher. Warmth gathered against her ribs like a living ember. The distant clatter returned. Closer now. Jasper turned his head and stiffened. He gave the faintest rumble, not a sound of threat, a sound that said move. Now, they left the clearing. Jasper took the lead on a line of paw prints he had carved over many nights. Claire moved behind him with slow, careful steps, one pup under her chin, two pressed to her chest, the lanky one stumbling at her heel. The forest swallowed them and the clearing became a pale memory behind the trunks. Snow muffled every footfall. Twigs tugged at her coat like thin fingers. Jasper glided through narrow gaps as if he had measured them long ago. Claire followed where she could and pushed through where she could not. The lanky pup paused often. Each pause was a tremble. Claire scooped it against her hip to cross a deadfall, then set it down again. It pressed to her boot for balance. They reached the ribbon of frozen water. She remembered it from the walk in, narrow, glazed with thin ice in places, clear water moving under in slow sheets. Jasper stepped on a tight set of stones near the edge where snow had packed firm. He crossed without a slide. He turned back and waited. Claire planted her foot on the first stone. It held. She shifted weight to the second. Ice cracked along its edge in a line that crawled outward like a thin lightning bolt. She drew her foot back and set it farther left. The crack held but did not spread. She breathed slowly. She looked down at the lanky pup at her heel. It watched her with a wide, helpless gaze. She crouched. She tucked the lanky one inside her coat beside the smallest. 4 small hearts thudded against her. Heat built under the fabric. Her own heartbeat was a drum. She tested the next stone with her boot and then stepped. The ice did not protest. She moved again and again until her toes scraped the far bank. Jasper stepped back to give her space. She planted her foot on solid snow and pulled herself up. The woods felt tighter on this side. Branches arched overhead in a tangled vault. The light that remained had a gray weight. Wind moved in a far layer above them. Down here the air felt still enough to hold. Jasper started forward at a quicker pace. He wanted speed. So did Claire. Yet speed would bring noise and a slip could shatter everything. She took longer steps but kept them soft. The pups shifted against her ribs and chest. Each shift was a reminder that the next misstep was not an option. They reached a low ridge marked by 2 birch trees that leaned together like gate posts. Claire brushed past the white trunks. Her shoulders stung where her coat had caught on the fence earlier. Jasper paused and sniffed the air. He looked back. His eyes showed a decision. He veered off the old path into a shallow swale between thorny bushes. The route was longer but hidden. The thorn branches tugged at her sleeves. One hooked a loop near her wrist and held like a claw. She freed herself with slow care. The forest created small tests and then larger ones. She thought about the gap they had squeezed through in the fence. The chain link, the yard, the kennels, the bowls lined on the shelf. Those images felt far away and also close enough to touch. She held to them like a rope in a storm. Halfway through the swale, the ground sank in a pocket of old leaves beneath the snow. Claire dropped to a knee. The pups let out a chorus of thin sounds that tore at her chest. She steadied herself with both hands and shifted weight onto her other leg. Jasper was beside her in an instant. He pressed his shoulder to her shin and braced. It was a small thing, yet it gave her a point of balance. She pushed back to standing and moved one slow step at a time until the drift firmed again. The clatter in the distance returned. No longer distant. It had a direction now, off to their right, a line that moved with them. The rhythm was wrong for a single animal. It was broken and uneven, as if something dragged, as if wood struck wood with each step. Claire did not like the sound. She did not like that it seemed to echo without a wind. Jasper angled left to put a denser patch of saplings between them and the sound. His tail stayed still and level. His ears twitched often. He scanned the path behind them more than before. Claire copied that habit, but saw only dark trunks layered like bars. They climbed a short rise and dropped into a grove where the snow had drifted in smooth waves. Claire tried to step where Jasper stepped so the weight pressed the same places. The pups had grown quiet. Warm breaths dampened the inside of her coat. She wished for more time, yet she knew that time was the enemy out here. They reached another clearing, not as open as the first. The center held a tangle of fallen branches stuck upright like a broken crown. Jasper halted. He sniffed the ground. He circled once and twice. Claire felt the hair on her arms lift even through the coat. Something had lain here not long ago. The place smelled wrong to Jasper. He chose a route that skirted the edge. Claire followed with each step balanced on caution. Halfway around the broken crown, she saw why Jasper had circled. Beneath the drift at the far side, a line of iron teeth stuck out like a bone. A trap no longer hidden by leaf litter or grass. Rust-edged, old yet still set. Snow dusted its jaws. The chain ran under the crust. The clatter sound from before suddenly made sense. Something had been here. Something had dragged a chain through the trees. Or maybe the trap had caught and then been pulled free. Her stomach tightened. Jasper moved forward with new care. He lifted each paw as if he saw more than one danger. Claire placed her feet in the exact spaces he left. She could feel heat roll off her chest with every breath. The pups stirred and pressed closer. They were heavy now only because fear added weight to all things. They cleared the crown and entered a corridor of tall pines that guided them toward the fence beyond the last stand of trees. A faint glint through the trunks hinted at metal. Relief rose and then crashed as the air ahead split with a new sound, not the clatter. A sharp crack like a branch breaking under a heavy fall, then a second sound that was lower, a growl that did not belong to Jasper. He was already moving. He stepped in front of her and planted his paws. The corridor of pines drew a line straight toward them, and in that line a shape advanced. Broad head, thick fur, breath huffed from a wide chest in bursts that fogged the air. The creature from the earlier clearing had found their path. It stopped a few paces away and held them in a gaze that felt like weight. Claire did not run. She could not. There was nowhere to go that did not pass the creature. She shifted her stance so her body shielded the pups as much as possible. Jasper leaned forward until his nose nearly touched the snow. His body formed a wedge. No sound left him. His silence was a different kind of threat. The creature stepped once. It did not lunge. It tested. It decided how bold they would be. Jasper did not yield. Claire did not move. The wind decided to shift and carried her scent toward the creature. Its ears twitched. Its eyes cut to her coat where small breaths fogged the zipper. It understood. It took another step. A sudden flutter broke in the trees above. A crow burst from a branch and dropped a clump of snow. The clump struck between Jasper and the creature and shattered into powder. The creature flinched. Its head turned for a fraction of a second. Jasper moved in that moment, not to attack. He bounded aside and kicked snow with his hind feet. A spray of white arced into the creature's face. It blinked and snorted and shook. Jasper shot past its flank in a tight curve and drew its gaze with sharp movements. Claire seized the chance. She moved sideways along the pines. Each step was a bite of ice. The fence glinted beyond the trunks. She kept her body square to the creature as she slid away so the pup stayed shielded. The creature's head swung back toward her. Jasper darted again. He cut across its vision and made himself the louder shape. The ground beneath Claire's left foot gave way without warning. A hollow hidden beneath the snow opened like a mouth. She fell to her knee and then farther. Her leg plunged into cold water up to the thigh. The edge of the hole crumbled under her weight. The shock blasted through her like a flare. The pups cried out together. Jasper spun toward her. The creature lifted its head and drew one heavy breath as if it had chosen a moment. Claire tried to pull free. Her boot stuck fast between roots under the surface. The cold was a blade that bit deep and sent pain up her spine. Water seeped into her pants and turned the fabric to stone. She grabbed at the edge of the hole and the snow broke again. The world lurched. The pups scrambled inside her coat and pressed hard against her chest. Jasper braced at the rim and barked once. The sound cracked the air like a snapped wire. The creature lowered its head and started forward with a steady tread that did not hurry and did not fear. The pines funneled it toward them. The fence waited behind its shoulder. The hole pulled at Claire's trapped leg like a hand that would not let go. Jasper planted his paws and made himself a barrier that was too small for the task, yet still the only thing that stood. The ice around her boot groaned. The creature took another step. Jasper did not move. Snow hissed around the rim of the hole, as if the ground itself breathed. Claire gripped the crust with numb fingers. Her trapped leg burned then went dull as the cold did its work. The fence glinted through the pines like a promise set just beyond reach. The creature advanced with a steady rhythm that spoke of patience. Jasper stood planted at the edge of the collapse. His body looked small against the bulk that moved toward them, yet he did not yield. Claire pushed down with her free foot. Mud sucked at her boot beneath the water. Roots laced her ankle like wire. She eased her leg an inch and felt a tooth of wood grind along the leather. Pain flashed from calf to hip. She bit the air and held the breath so the pups would feel stillness in her chest. They trembled and then grew silent. She pressed her knee against the rim. Snow gave way. She sank deeper by a hand's span. Water filled the gap and turned to needles on her skin. Jasper made a tight circle and slashed snow with his hind feet in a sharp spray. The creature blinked hard. It shook its head and snorted. Jasper cut across its path in a fast arc. The animal turned with slow irritation rather than fear. Jasper darted back. He did not run far. He kept the thing facing him and not the hole. Claire pressed her palms to a buried root and leaned her weight back. The root held. She pulled her knee up and twisted her foot. The leather scraped. The tooth of wood snagged deeper. She stopped and settled. Panic rose like fire. She forced herself to count slow beats in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4. She pulled again but changed the angle. The root under her hand shifted and groaned. Her boot moved a finger width. She tried again. Another finger. Then the root snapped and she lurched forward and nearly fell face first into the hole. She caught the rim and held. The creature took a measured step. Jasper lifted his lip and showed the hard line of his teeth without a sound. The animal paused and weighed him again. It had no rush. It had size and time and winter on its side. It took another step. Its breath fogged in pale bursts. Its eyes flicked once to Claire's coat, where 4 small shapes pressed against the fabric. It understood the burden and valued it. A new noise bled in from the far right. The clatter returned. It was heavier and closer and wrong in a way that made the skin on Claire's neck lift. Metal on wood, metal on stone. Drag, stop. Drag, stop. The creature turned its head to hear and did not like what it heard. It looked back at Jasper as if deciding whether to keep this game or abandon it for a simpler one down the corridor of pines. Claire pulled again. Her foot slid a little. She felt leather peel away at the heel. She braced and drove her free heel against the inner wall of the hole and yanked hard. The boot tore free with a wet wrench. Her leg shot out of the water. She rolled onto her side and gasped. The cold roared through her body, then became a steady ache. She scrambled to her knees and pushed to standing. Snow stuck to her soaked pants like armor made of ice. The pups squirmed, which meant they were still fighting. She placed her socked foot on packed snow. Needles of cold drove through the fabric as if the ground were made of glass. The drag sound grew loud. Branches moved below the pitch of the wind. Jasper flicked his eyes toward it and then back to the creature. He had a decision to make. He made it. He lunged forward and snapped at empty air inches from the creature's nose. Then he bolted sideways toward the sound. The creature followed with a frustrated bellow. Not a roar, more like a deep-chested complaint. Jasper led it away from Claire in a weaving route that forced the heavy body to change direction again and again. Each turn took effort. Each effort bought time. Claire moved. Slow at first because the socked foot was a block of ice and the snow grabbed it. She tested each step to avoid a new collapse. The fence grew brighter between trunks. She angled for the gap she had crawled through earlier. It was a small mouth near a low post where wire had bent back. The chain link bore a thin glaze. The edge glittered with hard frost. She reached it and pressed her shoulder against the metal. The cold leaped through her coat and bit the skin. She pushed the loose flap outward. Frost snapped like thin glass. The opening widened a little, not enough for a person, enough for a dog and maybe the smallest of the pups. The drag sound was now at the far end of the corridor. Jasper skidded around the last pine. The creature barreled after him, then stopped short. Another shape stumbled into view from the side path. It was lean and rangy and moved with a lurch. Iron teeth circled one foreleg above the paw. A short length of chain trailed behind and caught on roots and sticks with every step. The animal swung its head in a pain-slow arc. It was wild and desperate and saw everything as threat. The creature read the new arrival and lowered its head with dislike. It took a step toward the wounded animal. Jasper placed himself between them without hesitation. He was a ragged line drawn in snow. The larger animal hesitated as if the rules of this place had shifted and it did not like puzzles. Claire shoved her arm through the gap and slid the smallest pup out from her coat. She set it on the other side where the ground was clear and high. It curled tight and shivered but stayed. She passed the second and third the same way. The fourth clung to her shirt with tiny claws. She eased it loose and slid it through and then pressed her hand against all four to keep them from wandering. Their bodies were small furnaces. She pulled her hand back and crouched low to fit her shoulders through the gap. Metal tore along her sleeve, then along her shoulder blade. Fabric ripped. The cut of cold bit through to skin and sent a shock down her side. She exhaled and tried again and found a new angle, one shoulder through, then the other, her hip caught. She ground her teeth and wiggled the joint like a hinge and forced herself past. The fence scraped her back and left a line of fire. She dropped onto the sheltered side among thin bushes that grew against the metal. She spun to the opening and reached back toward Jasper. He was still dancing that tight pattern that made the large body turn and turn. The wounded animal staggered nearer, and the chain snagged on a low root. It fell and scrambled and dragged and fell again. Its panic filled the air like heat. It snapped at the trap, as if it could bite pain into silence. The creature shifted focus between prey that was easy and prey that was brave. It chose easy. It started toward the wounded one with a grim kind of patience. Jasper leaped across its path and cut a clean line that forced another turn. The large animal lifted a paw to swat him aside. Jasper ducked under and drove snow at its eyes. It blinked in surprise and swayed. The chain on the wounded animal jerked free and slapped a trunk with a ring that echoed. The animal lunged 3 steps and then stumbled. It crashed into brush and vanished in a struggle of branches and metal. The sound faded into the trees. The creature watched it go. The choice hung in the air: chase the wounded animal and win without work, or finish the problem that had irritated it since the first clearing. The creature turned back to Jasper. It started forward, slow at first, then faster, enough to close the space in a handful of strides. Claire did not think. She jammed both hands into the opening and snapped her fingers down against the metal to make a sharp metallic crack. The sound cut through the corridor like a whip. The creature flinched and looked her way. Jasper seized the opening and ran for the fence at a hard angle. The animal surged after him and would have reached him in 2 more steps if not for the narrow tangle of saplings that forced it to sway around a trunk. Those 2 steps were enough. Jasper dove for the gap. Claire reached and grabbed the rough fur at his shoulder and hauled. His ribs slid under the wire with a rough scrape. Metal caught his flank and left a thin, dark line. He popped through and tumbled into the bushes with a grunt, and then up again at once. He turned to the fence and planted his paws. The creature hit the chain link with a heavy thud. The whole section shuddered. Frost fell in a glittering sheet. The metal held but only just. The animal snarled low and deep and pressed its chest against the mesh. Wire bowed under the weight. A weld popped with a small report. Jasper stepped closer to the fence and showed his teeth. He did not bark. He stood like a stone set in a stream. Claire scooped the pups into her coat again with quick hands. She left the smallest on the ground for a breath while she slid the third under one arm and the fourth under the other. She lifted the smallest last and tucked it into her hood. The creature slammed the fence again. Another weld popped. The gap she had used creaked wider by a finger's width. She backed away through the brush with Jasper pressed against her leg. The metal groaned behind them. The animal paced along the fence until it reached the post where the wire was weakest. It threw its weight sideways and the mesh peeled with a scream. A new opening tore near the ground, not yet large enough for that heavy body, large enough for determination to try. Claire ran, not with speed that wasted energy, with a driving stride that ate ground and kept her feet under her. The yard lay ahead like a white field wrapped in a low glow from the shelter lights. The door at the back hallway was dark. Her key hung on a cord inside her coat. Her fingers were numb. She tried to remember how to work a lock when you could not feel metal or skin. They crossed the yard. Their tracks stretched behind like a map of a choice that could not be remade. She reached the door and braced the pups with one arm while the other fumbled with the zipper. She dug for the key and found it by touch. The metal was a stone of cold in her palm. She guided it toward a slot she could not see through the fog of breath and the swim of pain in her leg. Jasper stood turned to the yard. His body faced the fence. His eyes did not leave the dark line of trees. In that dark a shape moved slow and deliberate. It pressed once more at the torn mesh. Wire screamed again. Claire slid the key toward the lock. The tip grazed the edge and slipped. The shape at the fence dropped to its belly and pushed. Metal bent, snow sprayed, the gap grew. The key reached the lock and stopped against ice that had built in the cylinder. It would not go in. The key would not enter. Ice filled the lock like a plug of stone. Claire's fingers scraped at the frozen rim, nails bending in the cold. Breath poured from her in ragged bursts. The pups shifted and whimpered in her coat, their tiny claws pricking her skin through the damp layers. The wind swept across the yard and carried with it the low grind of wire tearing in the distance. Jasper's stance did not falter. His tail was low but rigid, his head forward, his ears fixed toward the trees. The sound from the fence came again, a sharp pop followed by the groan of metal surrendering to weight. Snow fell from the top rail in thin sheets as the shape on the far side worked its body closer to the opening. Claire slammed the key against the ice in the lock. The metal rang with a brittle note that vanished into the night. She could not feel her fingertips now. She set the pups carefully against the wall at her feet, curling her body over them to block the wind, then pulled the cord with the key up to her teeth. She gripped the flat end and bit hard, using the edge of her jaw to scrape frost from the grooves. Tiny shards of ice broke loose. She spat them out, fumbling to steady the lock with her other hand. Another weld on the fence snapped with a sound like bone breaking. Claire's eyes darted to the far yard. She could see movement now, low, deliberate, pressing forward. The creature's bulk bent the wire into a wide bow. Snow puffed outward as it pushed. Jasper growled low, a sound that rolled from his chest like a stone down a slope. The ice finally cracked inside the lock. Claire shoved the key in, twisting hard. The mechanism turned with a stiff clunk. She flung the door open and scooped the pups back into her coat in a single motion. They squirmed and squeaked, their warmth flooding back into her chest as she stepped inside and kicked the door shut behind her. The hallway's dim yellow light spread across the damp concrete floor, stretching toward the kennels. Jasper followed, but did not take his eyes off the door until the latch fell into place. His breath was sharp, fast, clouding the air in front of him. His flank still bore the thin dark scratch from the fence, the fur clotted slightly with frozen blood. He paced a few steps, circled the pups, and then pressed his body to them until they settled. Claire leaned against the wall for a long moment, letting the heat of the building begin to fight the deep cold in her soaked leg. Pain returned in waves as sensation crept back into her toes. She peeled off her wet sock with stiff fingers. The skin beneath was pale and mottled, but it would hold. The boots would need drying, but that was a problem for later. A sound made her head snap up. The fence. Even from inside, the sharp rasp of metal on metal carried through the night air. She moved to the narrow window set in the door. Beyond the yard, a darker shadow shifted along the fence line. The creature had not left. It paced back and forth, testing the wire with its weight, pressing in short bursts. Each push made the metal sway and groan. Claire turned the deadbolt with a quiet click. The solid thunk of the lock gave little comfort. She knew the door could hold against weather and most men, but the fence had not been made to stop something that large if it wanted in badly enough. Jasper had moved to the center of the hallway, sitting upright, gaze fixed on the door. His breathing slowed, though the focus in his eyes stayed sharp. The pups clustered together on the blanket Claire had thrown over them, their sides rising and falling in uneven rhythms. One licked the others as if to reassure them. Claire moved to the storeroom and pulled bags of food from the shelf, her hands still trembling. She poured dry kibble into a shallow pan and set it beside the blanket. The pups hesitated for a heartbeat before surging toward it, eating in quick, desperate mouthfuls. Their tails twitched weakly. She crouched beside Jasper and placed a hand on his back. His fur was still cold, damp at the tips, but beneath it, the muscle was warm and steady. He leaned into her touch without looking away from the door. She knew he would stay there all night if the shadow outside stayed too. The wind shifted again, pressing a thin whistle through the cracks in the frame. Somewhere out in the dark, snow crunched under slow, deliberate steps. The pacing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. Claire rose and went to the window once more. The yard looked still under its sheet of pale snow. The fence was no longer moving. The shadow was gone. She searched the tree line, waiting for a branch to shift or a patch of darkness to detach itself from the rest. Nothing moved. Jasper's ears twitched. He turned his head slightly toward the far corner of the building where the light from the security lamp faded into black. Claire followed his gaze. The snow there was untouched, until a breath later when it dented inward as though something had stepped down without making a sound. Her pulse thudded in her throat. The hollow in the snow deepened, then another appeared beside it. Steps, slow, measured, coming closer. Jasper rose and stood between her and the door again, his body angled to shield her and the pups. His fur lifted in a ridge along his back. The sound of the latch rattling filled the hallway, soft at first, then harder, as if something outside was testing the metal. The pups froze, ears pricked. The wind stilled. Every sound in the building seemed to narrow down to that single rattle of metal on metal. The latch stopped moving. Silence pressed in. Then, from just beyond the door, a low exhale rolled through the gap beneath it, a warm breath that curled into the cold air like a question left hanging. The breath beyond the door lingered for a moment, curling under the frame before fading into the cold. Claire held still, her hand resting lightly on Jasper's shoulder. His body was tense but not trembling, his head low, his ears forward. The pups huddled together in the blanket, eyes fixed on the doorway as if they understood what stood outside. Then came the sound of claws, slow, deliberate scrapes against the metal, followed by a heavy weight pressing once against the door. The hinges groaned. Claire stepped back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The deadbolt held, but the door shivered in its frame. Jasper moved forward until his nose almost touched the bottom edge. He did not bark. His silence was a wall as strong as his body. Another push from outside bowed the door inward a fraction, enough to make the light above sway on its chain. Claire's gaze darted to the narrow window, but whatever was out there kept just out of sight. She thought of the fence, the tearing metal, the slow, relentless way it had crossed the yard. The same patience was here now, testing, waiting, finding the weak places. From deeper in the hallway came the faint creak of floorboards. She turned, heart thudding. No one else should be here at this hour. The sound came again, closer, measured, as if someone walked the back hall toward her. Jasper's ears flicked, but his gaze stayed locked on the door. Claire took a slow step toward the intersection of the corridors, her hands empty, her breath shallow. The overhead light buzzed faintly, the only sound besides the shifting of weight beyond the door. A shadow slid across the wall ahead of her, tall, not animal, not quite human in the way it moved. The pups gave a sharp squeak in unison, a sound more startled than afraid. Claire's stomach turned cold in a way the winter air had never managed. The figure stepped into view. It was a man, broad-shouldered, wrapped in layers of dark fabric, his face half covered by a hood. His eyes swept the hallway, stopping briefly on her before sliding to the door where Jasper stood guard. In his right hand hung a length of chain, its end jagged with rust. The smell of iron and snow clung to him. "You have something," he said, his voice flat, low. Claire's mind raced. No direct speech, but the weight of his words sat heavy in the air. The pups shifted, curling tighter into one another. Jasper's tail lowered further, his muscles coiling. The man took another step, the chain's end dragging across the floor with a hollow scrape. Outside, the pressure on the door eased, as if whatever was out there sensed its part in this was done for now. The silence that followed was almost worse. Claire shifted her stance, keeping her body between the man and the pups. The security light outside flickered once, sending a brief flash through the window. For that moment she saw the glint of something in his other hand, not metal, but a scrap of fabric, wet and dark. The man's gaze cut to the pups. "They're mine," the tone implied, not spoken but in the way his eyes narrowed. He took another step, and Jasper moved with him, keeping the same distance, his teeth just visible in the dim light. Claire's mind clawed for options. The nearest phone was in the office at the far end of the hall, too far to reach without turning her back. The keys were in her coat pocket, but the main gate to the outside world was locked tight, and beyond it was only the night and whatever waited in the tree line. The man lifted the chain, not high, but enough for the sound of its links to carry in the quiet. Jasper lowered his head and gave a single deep growl, the kind that rolled from his chest like a warning carved in stone. The standoff stretched. Then, faint at first, came the sound of sirens, distant but rising, winding their way through the empty night. The man's gaze twitched toward the sound. The pup stirred, sensing the shift. He took a slow step back, eyes never leaving Jasper's. Another step. Then he turned and walked down the hall the way he had come, the chain dragging softly behind him until the sound faded into the hum of the lights. Claire stood still for several breaths, listening for any sign he might return. When none came, she crossed to the door and checked the deadbolt again. It was still locked. Outside, the yard was empty under the pale wash of the security lamp. Jasper moved to the pups and lay beside them, curling his body around the smallest. They pressed against him, their breathing slow and steady now. Claire crouched beside them, resting a hand on his back. His fur was warm again, his body calm but alert. The sirens grew closer, their echo rolling off the trees. Help was coming. But as Claire sat there in the dim hallway with Jasper and the pups, she knew that no matter who arrived, it was this small, scruffy dog who had truly saved them all. In the silence between the wail of sirens, she heard only the steady rhythm of Jasper's breathing and the quiet promise in it that he would keep watch for as long as it took.